We're following right now, coming directly from the White House, an intruder scaling a fence at the White House, making it all the way to a residential entrance while President Trump was inside. Officials say a man carrying a backpack was arrested by the south entrance to the executive residence just before midnight last night after being discovered by U.S. Secret Service officer. The White House was placed under security condition orange. That's what they call it, one of the highest levels of security for the U.S. Secret Service. Let's discuss all of this now with CNN's Ryan Nobles in Washington. CNN senior White House correspondent Jeff Zeleny also with us, but on the phone. So, Jeff, I understand you have new information. What do you have? And then we'll get to you, Ryan.
Well, Frederica, this is still being investigated by the Secret Service, just how this intrusion could have happened late last night. The concern that they have, that we are hearing from officials, is that this intruder made it so far onto the grounds of the White House, indeed to near the south portico entrance of the White House. So it wasn't simply a fence jumping incident. Those are somewhat routine that the Secret Service has to deal with. But this is the gravity of this is the thing that concerns the service the most, is just how far this intruder made it onto the property. But look, this is one of the things that, as you've been talking about all morning, that the White House and the Secret Service have been dealing with for a long time. But this, of course, the first one in the Trump administration, and it certainly raises all types of questions about security at the White House and protecting this president in particular. But again, a senior administration official I talked with this morning said the president, of course, was not harmed. He appreciates the service, and he has grown quite fond of his agents and his detail, and vice versa here. So this is something that you can be sure will be reviewed come Monday, certainly by Congress as well, Frederica.
And Ryan Nobles there at the White House. You mentioned when you came in early this morning, it didn't seem as though anything were awry at the White House, but then you did receive a formal statement from U.S. Secret Service. And what now are they willing to publicly reveal?
Well, and we can take it a step further, Frederica, because we now have a copy of the arrest report from the Metropolitan Police Department. So this individual was arrested by the U.S. Secret Service, but then processed by the Metropolitan Police Department here in Washington, D.C. And in this arrest report, the suspect said, quote, "I am a friend of the president. I have an appointment and I jumped the fence." So this is the first kind of insight that we're getting into the motivation of this individual to jump the fence, as Jeff said, and then try and gain access to the White House. It doesn't appear to be malicious intent, at least based on this quote. His hope was to have a conversation with President Trump. It reminds me of back in the summer when that young man tried to scale Trump Tower with a similar intention of trying to just get an audience with the then candidate Trump. So we're still learning all the information, but that still doesn't downplay at all the significance of this major security breach for him to be able to get over a fence on the south side of the White House, get across the White House lawn and gain entrance, or I shouldn't say entrance, but get close to that south portico entrance, which we should point out would put him only about 200 feet from the president's window, his bedroom window, and the president was in the residence at the time. This is certainly something that Secret Service is going to have to take a very close look at, and perhaps further changes and reforms will be made to the security situation here.
You know, and Jeff, for obvious reasons, it's so alarming because there are so many perimeters when you talk about security at the White House. It's not just within the confines or along the fence. It's outside of that, along the fence. It's within the property, and then, of course, within the White House. There are many layers, is my bottom line.
Exactly.
Many layers in which this person was able to bypass before being
exactly.
discovered.
And as Ryan was just saying, we are getting our first look here at this police report from the Metropolitan Police Department, and it gives a bit of a narrative to what happened. As Ryan was saying, the person is reported to have said, "No, I am a friend of the president. I have an appointment." And this officer asked him how he got there, and the suspect reportedly said, quote, "I jumped the fence." Frederica, the interesting part about this is he was not seen jumping the fence by all of the layers of security. He was simply bumped into by an officer on the south side of the White House here. And this police report also confirms for the first time that White House security footage shows that the suspect jumped the northwest courtyard fence of the Treasury building adjacent to the White House. So this is confirming what our sources were telling us, and CNN's Peter Morris was reporting earlier this morning, that he jumped the fence between the Treasury building and the White House. It's kind of all part of the same complex, but there's a bigger fence there. But so interesting here that it appears, at least from this police report, that this Secret Service officer essentially bumped into this suspect on the grounds of the White House and was not detected until that moment.
And so Tom Fuentes, back with the senior law enforcement analyst and former FBI assistant director, as well as Jonathan Wacrow, CNN law enforcement analyst. So when you hear that kind of detail, Tom, you first, how concerning is it to you that it would be penetrable? You know, that big Treasury Department office building is quite sizable. It's massive. It's huge. But one would think that all law enforcement in around the White House would know about any potential openings between that building, that property, and the White House property.
Right. That's what concerns me the most here, is that if that story is true that's put in the report, then that means that he came over the fence, wasn't detected, that he got inside the lawn area of the White House, wasn't detected, sensors didn't go off, cameras didn't go off, at least at that time, to send a warning, and he bumped into somebody on the grounds, like accidentally. Yeah. This sounds rather bizarre to me, and I would like to hear more about exactly how he was detected and what they knew. And if he hadn't bumped into this one individual, what would have happened then? How far could he have gotten?
And Jonathan, your former Secret Service, to hear that kind of detail from Jeff, that someone, patrolling would bump into this suspect, can you envision that?
Well, listen, this is really troubling. If someone came over the northwest fence of the Treasury complex, what that indicates is that they didn't just go over one fence, they went over multiple fences. Even though it's considered part of the 18 acres of the White House complex, there are multiple gates and fences that separate both the Treasury and the White House grounds. So this has the potential to be a catastrophic breach of the White House complex, just by the fact that he came in from the northwest section, worked his way all the way to the south grounds, got onto the south grounds, and then proceeded up towards the diplomatic reception room entrance, the south portico area. This is really disturbing. Just the amount of real estate that this intruder was able to gain or bypass on the complex. So the Secret Service has to really take a very hard look very quickly as to why weren't other defensive measures, alerted, alarms, gates, etc., through all of that real estate that this individual covered.
So, Jonathan, there's been a real changing of the guard with the, head of the Secret Service, long time, head of the Secret Service departing. Would that kind of transition also create these kinds of gaps that could arise that would allow someone to be undetected in that fashion, if those details that we're hearing now from Jeff are exactly that?
No, with Joe Clancy, the director of the Secret Service, retiring, there's no correlation directly to this incident. But where there is a connection is that Joe Clancy was brought in to mitigate this exact problem. In 2014, the Secret Service had a very embarrassing breach off the north fence line, and actually had an intruder enter into the White House. Right. Joe Clancy was brought in to resolve that and fix that. And one of the very first things we talked about in 2014 was raising the level of the fences around the White House. Joe Clancy just retired in 2017. The fence is still the exact same height. So what does that speak to in terms of the ability for the Secret Service to get funding and drive initiatives not only through Congress, but through a bureaucratic DHS structure?
And Ryan, you're there on the White House grounds. Any rumblings, anyone within Secret Service or otherwise who has expressed that kind of concern that there's been seemingly a reticence to promote some changes?
Not specifically, Frederica, and I really have to point out how mundane things were here this morning. When I got here at about 8:45, it's as quiet as this White House has been since I've been covering the Trump administration and since he's taken office, we've obviously had a lot of interesting weekends to report on here. So I was actually surprised at how quiet it was. And I should also point out that you may be able to see them here behind me. There are people exiting the White House taking public tours. So those public tours were back up and running in relatively short order, despite the fact that Secret Service was still investigating the grounds. And I think it's also important for us to emphasize the fact that this suspect was only 200 feet away from the president's bedroom window, and he had a backpack with him. So even though there are all those additional layers of security, had he gained access to the White House, it turned out that that backpack did not contain hazardous materials. But if it did, and if he were able to do something nefarious with it, we would have had a very serious incident here. That obviously didn't happen in this case, but as we talked about all day, going down the road, when you talk about increasing security, it's pretty remarkable that someone was able to get that close to the president's window with a backpack in his possession.
And Jeff, this too happening on just a few days away from, we saw some of the first images of President Trump interacting with people who were there at the White House. And this is a weekend that is also appearing to be a rare occasion in which President Trump is at the White House. He's been spending many weekends at Mar-a-Lago. Are you seeing any real, correlations or concerns here?
It certainly is interesting that it did happen on a weekend when the president was at the White House. We do not know if that was just by accident, that this suspect, who we're also seeing now on this police report as we read through it, had a California driver's license. We do not know if he was living in the Washington area or if he came from California. But again, he said, I am a friend of the president. That is obviously not how most friends of the president go visit him, by jumping a fence and, at almost midnight. So obviously that is not the situation here. But Frederica, we do not know, and it will be interesting to find out if the suspect knew that the president happened to be home. So that's why he did it on this day. But it certainly is well publicized and announced when he is home and when he is not. But the big difference to me, I think, as we've been talking about, that is different from the incident during the Obama administration of someone coming in on the other side of the White House, is that the president was indeed home. At that point, the Obamas were not home. Right. At this point, the president was home. And he certainly, had it been a nice evening out, it was cold. It was about 25 degrees or so the president wouldn't be outside. But had it been a warm evening, he could certainly be outside on that lawn. That is part of the secure facility here. So that's why this is a big deal, Frederica.
Yeah, it is a very sizable deal. All right, thank you so much, Jeff Zeleny, Ryan Nobles, Tom Fuentes, Jonathan Wacker. I'll check back with all of you. Meantime, coming up, Vice President Mike Pence hits the road to sell the GOP health care bill as Republicans remain divided over it. What will it take to get the legislation passed? That's ahead in the CNN Newsroom.
CNN Newsroom.